Resilience Fellow. And then we also have Julie Rosenbach with the City of South Portland. I think Troy Moon with the City of Portland is joining. And then we also have Julie Taft, Robin Landis, Katie Timms, and Carly Meyer and Megan Daly, who are with Portland and South Portland. Today we're joined by Nell Donaldson with the City of Portland Planning Department. She's the Director of Special Projects, and Milan Nevajda, who is the City of Portland Director of Planning. Um, to discuss climate resilient zoning um, and some of the changes that we have made and are making. I'll hand it over to Nell.
Great, thanks, Brenda. I know some of you on this call, but not most of you. My name is Nell Donaldson. I'm the Director of Special Projects, as Brenda mentioned, in the City of Portland Planning Department. And I'm just going to spend a little while talking about some recent climate resilience zoning work that we have completed, and as much as you can ever complete any of this work in the City of Portland as of the end of last year. We called this work, and I will start sharing. Let me know if I'm doing something wrong, Brenda, speak up. We called this our climate resilience zoning effort. And it was a multi-year process. We're good. Let me just get to present mode. Is it in present mode? Let's see. Now it is, I believe. Speak up if somebody's seeing something they shouldn't see.
Looks like you're in present mode. You're good.
Perfect. Great. Okay. So this was a multi-year process that we embedded within our larger land use code rewrite that we called Recode in the City of Portland. It was sort of a soup to nuts multi-year effort to rewrite our entire land use code. It included changes to our historic preservation regulations and lots of housing related work, and this really important climate resilience zoning work. And the basic concept behind this effort was that our land use code is one tool that we can use to affect the broader resilience of this community, in as much as it affects how we build and use space in the City of Portland or any place that has zoning and land use regulations. So the idea is that we could use the land use code to really manage risks to private property associated with climate change, and that we could also use the land use code to mitigate impacts of climate change and really sort of use development as a resilience strategy. So, or use land use change as a climate resilience strategy. So we're lucky here in Portland and in South Portland as well that we have a really strong foundation in citizen action and stakeholder engagement and planning around this issue. The folks on this call, you all know this very well, but there's a lot of foundational work at the state level as well as at the local level in terms of planning for the future in terms of climate change. And so One Climate Future, as well as the state's climate action plan, really provided a really strong foundation for the work we did here in the City of Portland in terms of providing a menu of climate change related strategies that we could embrace in our land use code. Also in terms of establishing a technical baseline for actually projecting risks and providing a sort of common understanding about what risks we were dealing with, and setting the stage for sort of funding tools that were central to us finishing this work. So coming out of One Climate Future at the City of Portland, we collaborated with the City of South Portland again and the Army Corps of Engineers to develop, first and foremost, a regional hydrodynamic model that could more accurately help us understand the future risks associated with sea level rise and storm related flooding. And then we applied for a statewide community action grant to actually fund the climate resilience zoning work. We got that funding and embedded this work within our local land use reform effort. So there's sort of three things we were trying to tackle with our climate resilience zoning effort. At the whole city level, we were trying to tackle risks associated with high heat. We know we have more intense heat, more high heat days, and stormwater, again, more intense precipitation, more frequent storms. And then in a more sort of confined geographic area, we know, everybody knows, we are facing risks associated with flooding, in association with sea level rise and storm surge. I'm going to talk about all three of these risk factors in the work we did in our zoning. I'm going to spend the most time on the coastal flooding response, just because that's one that people are broadly interested in, and I think it dovetails with work that South Portland is doing. The basic principle of our response to the coastal flooding risk is not new. It's about elevating uses to get them out of harm's way. This is a pretty basic concept. There's lots of communities around the country that are doing work and responding to flood risk in this way. In the city of Portland, as in many communities across the country, we, prior to this work, we have a system for managing flood risk. It's the FEMA floodplain maps and our floodplain regulations, but these regulations don't account for sea level rise. So this is a map that's showing the FEMA floodplain and where we are regulating uses in the FEMA floodplain. This is a map that shows the work we did with the Army Corps of Engineers to really understand sea level rise, associated flooding. So this map shows the results of the hydrodynamic model, which projected a 100-year storm plus 3.9 feet of sea level rise in the year 2100. So you can see, I'll show you a comparison. There's a couple of areas where the FEMA floodplain, versus the hydrodynamic model, you see a really broad difference, particularly in Bayside and downtown and the waterfront. So though FEMA has done a lot of things, those regs have done a lot of things well, the hydrodynamic model shows in a different set of risks in a different area and at a different level. And so we built our coastal flood resilience overlay zone off of this hydrodynamic model. And just quickly, brief stop. We're lucky in doing this work, that lucky and unlucky in lots of ways, but that recent experience really shows that the hydrodynamic model is accurate, right? We have recent experience in the city of Portland and South Portland too, of flooding that really maps with what the hydrodynamic model was showing. And I think this was something that worked in our favor in developing this zoning, right? People understand there's a risk here and that we need a coordinated response. And so sort of getting this zoning underway and help, we didn't have to work terribly hard to help people understand why this was necessary. Just a quick stop too on these sort of two areas that are most vulnerable or showing the most vulnerability in our hydrodynamic model. They're, Bayside and the waterfront are different areas with different opportunities and different sort of futures and different sort of barriers and constraints. And so when we were thinking about developing our response to the sort of sea level rise risk, we were really trying to craft a regulatory tool that could be flexible enough to handle these different areas, right? Bayside, you've got fill from that mid-19th century fire. You have an industrial legacy of large blocks, urban renewal legacy of large blocks close to downtown. The zoning there the base zoning has been very flexible and promoting lots of development. It's close to downtown. It's an area with lots of opportunity. The waterfront presents a different environment, right? We have waterfront uses that are sort of prepared to get wet in lots of ways. We have on the upland side a historic sort of context that isn't seeing much development or change in terms of building. And there we recognize we need a more like adaptive strategy, right? And so we were trying to write the code for various types of places and provide flexibility, and with the basic premise that we're not ready to retreat from these areas. We need to manage risk in the place we're at right now, and still let things happen in a smart way. So the approach is what we're calling our coastal flood resilience overlay zone. It basically follows the areas that intersect with that hydrodynamic model. So this is that model again. Any area that shows flooding in that hydrodynamic model under under that sea level rise scenario, 3.9 feet, is in the coastal flood resilience overlay zone. It's important to note the requirements of FEMA still apply. And we developed this zone, again, this idea of flexibility using sort of a tiered approach. So there's a couple of sort of concepts that are central to the way we wrote the zoning. And one sort of first and foremost is that we want to be stringent where it matters the most, where we're most concerned about vulnerable uses and vulnerable buildings. We want to plan for future adaptation in other contexts, and then certain things are okay to get wet, and we can let things get wet as long as we are smart about it. And so we wrote the zoning with sort of tiered use paradigms. So certain uses are exempt: marine uses, parking uses, storage uses, these sort of uses that can get wet, can withstand periodic episodic flooding. We set a second sort of bar of uses that we called non-critical uses. These are uses that are not generally, people are not most vulnerable when they're in these places, right? People can choose when they're at a restaurant or they're going shopping. So these are uses that people can sort of plan whether to be in at times when there might be flooding. And then critical uses, places where people are sleeping, basic functions of government. These are places that are super vulnerable in the context of sea level rise and storm surge. And then we also tiered the regulations based on sort of the type of work. So the idea here is that there's a lower threshold for the standards of the Coastal Flood Resilience Overlay Zone for critical uses. Again, those places where people are most vulnerable, but there's sort of a higher standard, or a higher threshold, I apologize, for these non-critical and clearly exempt uses. So the zoning is really pretty simple. The idea is there's a sea level rise base flood elevation based on that hydrodynamic model. We set one sea level rise base flood elevation throughout the entire zone. Lots of communities take different approaches to this, but we wanted these regulations to be simple and understandable and easy for folks to sort of deal with at the site level. So that sea level rise base flood elevation is 13 feet across the entire coastal flood resilience overlay zone in the city of Portland. And basically the way the zoning works, exempt uses are allowed anywhere in the zone relative to that sea level rise base flood elevation. Non-critical uses, again, restaurants, retail, needs to be within 2 feet of that sea level rise base flood elevation. So it can actually be 2 feet below that sea level rise base flood elevation. And that's, again, about making, these uses that people can sort of choose to be within or without. There's other flood proofing that can help with these types of spaces. And then critical uses are required to be 1 foot above that 13-foot sea level rise base flood elevation. Again, places where people are sleeping, schools, these sort of critical functions and sort of most vulnerable places need to be elevated. That's it. That's the basic approach. And we did, it is worth noting, a couple of other things in our zoning to sort of accommodate for the fact that that regulations like these start to bump up against other goals that we have at the city, right? So we want first floors particularly in mixed use areas of the city, like parts of Bayside or like downtown or the waterfront. We want them to be active. We want people to be able to see in the first floor windows. We want people to be able to access them in a wheelchair, the first floors of these buildings. And so we did a couple things, particularly in our dimensional standards, to sort of compensate for what we're requiring in terms of ground floor elevation. One, we allowed additional height. So in the coastal flood resilience overlay zone, you're allowed to measure height from the design flood elevation. So that gives people a little bit more headroom, so to speak, to go up, to compensate for the fact that we're requiring them to build that first floor up. And then we provided some exceptions around setbacks and build-to zones so that people could fit things like ramps, stairs, so they could deal with that sort of interface with the street in ways that are creative, and then again allow us to meet other goals that we have in terms of the public realm and ADA accessibility, et cetera. Just very quickly, this zoning is not very old. So we haven't seen, it's a year old. So we haven't seen a lot of development within the coastal flood resilience overlay zone yet. But we do have a couple of projects that are sort of in the pipeline. One is on this site in Bayside. I'm showing on this slide the design flood elevation for critical uses. So here's a site, and we're saying through these zoning regulations, if you're going to put housing here, you need that first floor to be 5.5 feet above grade, is what this graphic is showing, which is high, right? That's my height. That's the where the floor is on a housing development on this site. That's what we're basically showing here. We spent a while, developing graphics to help people understand the general public sort of understand how people might manage this requirement inside and outside buildings. Again, this is where these requirements are sort of interfacing with other goals that we have at the city around the public realm. There are ways to manage these changes in ground floor plane, again, interior or exterior, to buildings, and we wanted to allow people flexibility to do both. Again, these are just some examples from some buildings here more successful than others, from around Portland and Boston, showing elevated first floors in ways that architects and designers and builders have sort of managed grade changes. So this is actually the rendering of the project on that Bayside parcel that I showed before. And what we see here, this is not under review yet, but this is a developer and designers sort of managing those base flood elevations by doing interesting things with landscaping, by placing lobby and sort of gym space on the first floor and residential above. So we're seeing people respond with creative ways of, again, managing that first floor elevation with things that on the outside and along the street frontage that do something to enhance the public realm. So that's the Coastal Flood Resilience Overlay Zone. Again, a centerpiece of our climate resilience zoning strategy here in the city of Portland. The second risk factor we were trying to deal with in the climate resilience zoning was high heat. I mentioned it before. It's just a heat island index map that shows you, not surprisingly, how heat sort of plays out over the city of Portland's geography. We did a couple things with our land use code to try to address heat, mostly through development. So when we're seeing sites be developed in the city of Portland, we embraced in the recode some additional standards to try to make sure that we're dealing with heat island effect sort of comprehensively. So we essentially enhanced our canopy requirements for all development sites. So parking lot and paved area canopy requirements across all types of sites, even without parking areas. And then our street tree standards, we modified as well to try to sort of more accurately get at the sort of heat island issue that we're actually trying to deal with in terms of shade trees. We also established some cool roof and cool paving requirements. So certain projects in the city are now required to meet solar reflective index standards for roofs, as well as non-vehicular paved areas on development projects need to meet solar reflective index standards. And just very quickly, the last risk factor we sort of tried to address in our climate resilience zoning was stormwater. Again, this is a huge issue. And we did some work with our Department of Public Works to try to standardize and simplify our stormwater requirements in the city of Portland, to address redevelopment sites more actively. A lot of the projects we see in Portland are not greenfield projects. They are redevelopment sites. And so how can we make sure that those sites are doing what they can to sort of absorb and treat and slow down stormwater runoff before it enters the sort of public system? So we also added detention and infiltration standards on all projects across the city that are entering the system, just sort of standardizing what had been sort of an ad hoc process before, and again, sort of standardized standards about slowing the rate of runoff. And we also did some work to address those greenfield sites where they exist. So we do see some greenfield development, and so we tried to sort of strengthen our standards around wetland fill and strengthen our standards around low impact development more generally. It's interesting to, this is my last slide, but it's interesting to end on this slide. I think we are seeing, this is a place where we are seeing big goals at the state and local level around housing development sort of bump up against some of our other goals around things like managing stormwater and protecting wetlands and all of these really important things. And so actually we're in the process right now of 1 year after Recode refining our low impact development approach to try to sort of balance these things a little more effectively than we are coming out of Recode. So in the last year, and so I mean that's an interesting place to land. The sort of takeaway there is we feel good about the climate resilience zoning package that we got through at the end of last year, the coastal flood resilience overlay zone, and then these other things I've just mentioned. But this is all a work in progress. And so I think there's a sort of evolution in these types of regulations that we'll continue to see in the city of Portland, and we are always sort of watching to see how these regulations work as they bump up against other goals again, to trying to calibrate everything so we can have a more resilient future, but we can continue to allow housing to be built and all these other things that we want to see built in the city of Portland as well. So with that, I will pass it to Milan, unless we need to stop back at you, Brenda. Nope, Milan.
Thanks, Nell. That was a great lead in and covered a lot of ground on, sort of the framework of the CRAWs. I think what I want to focus on for us, because we sort of picked the baton up after Portland had already gone through its motions and tested out some of the kinks, and also got the consultant familiar with our context. So we're using the same consultant who's, again, now familiar with the hydrodynamic model, which serves both cities and the general context, but also has done it for a number of other communities. So we felt we're sort of well prepared to get into the nuanced questions of what South Portland has that's unique, from the risks and opportunity side, and then try to strike the right balance. There are some really critical, policy changes or new directions that we have to and want to explore. So I'm going to kind of maybe just try to emphasize those with the goal to just highlight, I think, just how specific and detailed these ordinances need to be in order to address the localized conditions. So no two towns are alike, no two shorelines are alike, and different outcomes, need to be explored to make sure that things fit right. And I think I'm not sure if Nell, hit on this, but I'm assuming they kind of have the same mindset that because of the complexity of this, condition that we're all trying to prepare for, which is, dynamic flood conditions in an unpredictable environment over an unspecified period of time, there's going to need to be revisiting and re-engaging with this ordinance and refining and learning as we go. So, this is an effort to move in the right direction, I guess, is sort of how we're approaching it and trying to get as much covered that we feel comfortable that we understand, and be prepared so that we're not, caught in a worse position later, but we're sort of continuing to build and get better. So I think Nell, you've got oh no, I can just override your screen share. There we go. Do that. I don't have a lot to go over, and I'll try to keep it brief so we can focus on questions. But what I want to highlight just sort of what our experiences in South Portland, what we understand the model is showing us, that, Nell walked you all through. There are limitations to our model, even though we've, spent the time with the Silver Jackets team preparing for, additional data and adding additional data to the inundation map so we can understand the future projections. But there are still limitations to that. And at the end of this presentation, I'm just going to kind of highlight what we have identified as some next steps to get better at closing some of those data gaps. Um, but the first three slides I have are just to highlight, and let me get to the full view here. Just to highlight what we see in South Portland. So this is the FEMA projections for inundation in our area. The biggest deficiency with FEMA is that they're largely looking in the rearview mirror and not really baking in forward projections for sea level rise, and that's what we've all wanted to tackle and address. But we have some sort of remnant areas that are affected, a lot of it undeveloped in sort of the riparian corridors. But some property owners are really seriously dealing with flooding. And as Nell said too, the January 2024 storms really pushed these boundaries and affirmed that some of the projections are pretty accurate when we don't factor in sea level rise. So we really need to start factoring that in. So the Hannaford, for instance, it's off to the map left here. Obviously, their parking lot, we have photos of water waves lapping in during that storm. So it's very real, and also like in Portland, it helped build that momentum to understand the need for these changes. Our hydrodynamic model shows us that this is our exposure to risk of flooding under the 3.9 feet of sea level rise scenario. These different color gradients on the map are just adding to the model various additional flood conditions. So I'm not going to get into the model because I don't think that's our focus for today. But whether you're in the blue, the orange, or the red, these are high tide or storm conditions layered on top of a 3.9 feet of sea level rise. So unlike what FEMA is telling us is the risk area, we see these additional areas as needing serious attention. And then if we look at our sort of longer range planning horizon, this is with 8.8 feet, and again the same thing, waves plus storms plus tides built in. I mentioned at the beginning the one of the limitations of our model is that we don't, unlike FEMA, we don't have all the component parts of wave-induced flood risk. So there's all kinds of layers to this, is how much the wave has built up out over still water, how much of that wave is still present when it gets to landmass, and how much of that is then coming in at force with energy behind it, because that's different than just calm waters. There's energy that puts pressure on structures, and so we need to think about all of those cuts. And so we're looking at exploring the model, building on it, and adding in some of those wave action components. What's interesting from these maps that maybe isn't immediately evident? I mean, you see the maps and you just see, okay, new areas need to prepare for water. That's obviously the takeaway. But the other things we see with South Portland are that we're relatively dry for some period of time here. And once we reach some sort of critical threshold, and it's hard to say exactly when that will occur and at what level of sea level rise will create that, we get a wide swath of area affected. And so there's a little bit of like a plateau effect happening in some of our older neighborhoods, particularly Fairley Village, where it's sort of dry, 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 pretty okay, just the coastal fringes having pressure from waves and storms, and then at some point it's sort of a tipping point and it washes over this sort of tabletop. And one of the issues we have is that means that a big physical horizontal area is our area of concern. So that's one factor that we need to really be thinking about. The other is that when we look at amplified sea level rise and what some of these maps are showing, you see that the red and yellow areas, which are associated with tidal conditions, so high tides or daily tides, versus the blue, which is the storm areas, they start to get very, very similar. And again, this speaks to our topography and our elevations. And when we look at what model should we prepare for, or which areas should be required to prepare for flooding in a more aggressive way, we need to be thinking about well, are we preparing for the storm situation? Is that the most reasonable thing, which is a very low percentage throughout the year in comparison to tides, which might happen twice a day? What's the most reasonable thing? So for us, just because of the shape of our land, the way that we've used our land, those have been really areas that we've been diving into and trying to understand and trying to get that nuance just right. Um, Another point, just because I'm following up on the Portland presentation, is the way we use our land is sort of critical. The inundation areas that Nell was highlighting for Portland, a lot of those are on the peninsula or surrounding the peninsula, in areas that are highly, highly urbanized, and have a heavy commercial component and a mixed use component. And the vision there is sort of higher density mixed use development. We have that in our downtown. That's our Mill Creek Peninsula off to the map left here. Certainly not at the scale of Portland, but that's sort of the ethic or the general trend and how the historical build out of the peninsula is. But Ferry Village is very much not that. It's a patchwork of single family small lots, and we're dealing with many, many actors, property owners, tenants on much, much smaller scale that don't have as much land to work with to accommodate whatever they need to accommodate in order to protect themselves and the community in the long-term decision making. So we need to understand that context too. And I think that's somewhat of a differentiating factor from Portland, South Portland's policy making. And we'll see how that all evolves as we get to actually presenting out draft plans and speaking with our elected officials and working through the nuances of the ordinance. I want to, because we're in the plan or the ordinance writing phase, we're not kind of having it written and looking back on how it's working. I do want to just highlight our process a little bit. So we were understanding the maps and understanding our conditions and what are our sort of areas where we need to spend more time with the consultant, that we can't just sort of rinse and repeat what Portland might have done, or what Portsmouth or any other town might have done. We felt it was important to pull together a group of residents that had been engaged with us for many, many weeks, months, years, even on this topic, and going to bring them into the fold and work through some of the data and some of the maps and some of the conditions that we were seeing, so that they can help us understand how they understand the situation and what questions arise for them, and what, even some of them are property owners in affected areas, what are they calculating on their side of things? What are they getting anxious about, and so on. So we formed this group of, I think it was like 15 to 25 people. I can't remember the exact number, that went through a series of organized training sessions on just the materials and the data. How do you understand elevations? How do you understand sea level rise dynamics? Get them sort of coached up on that stuff, so we all have similar vocabulary and can at least express our thoughts in a way that other people will understand in the group. And then we did a series of workshops where we went through the most critically affected community areas. And I'm sort of highlighting on these maps the downtown and Ferry Village area, just because I think they raise the most interesting policy questions across the most broad set of policy issues. But there's certainly other areas affected. I'm not diminishing the importance and significance of the impact in Willard, for instance, on our eastern shore. It's just anyway, so don't take away that these are the only two areas we care about. It's just where we had the most concentration of different issues to focus on. So we did workshops around downtown. This is just some of our maps about what we looked at, and it was instructive on just what our current conditions are. The other thing that we were really keen to do is to understand the physical reality of some of these numbers. So NAVD 88, I just had a interview yesterday with a reporter on an article related to coastal development. We really spent quite a bit of time trying to understand what NAVD 88 is trying to do, and what's the point of it. I'm happy to answer that in questions, because I don't want to repeat stuff that this group might already be familiar with. But we really needed to know, when we say, like in Nell's case, it's 13 point whatever feet is their target of designing for flood resistance. And here, what are we designing for? We needed to see how that looks on the ground, because it's one thing to say, you need to raise up six feet, or you need to shoot for NAVD 88, 90, 19 feet. Well, does that mean the building's going to be 19 feet in the air and floating above? How does that actually work within the fabric of things? How does that become a community that I want to live in or I can actually interact with? So those were important questions for us as well. I do want to just pan around, and I think if I can, maybe for like 2 to 5 minutes max, just look at what we saw in the case of Hannaford, and I think it was really interesting. And everyone here, at least from South Portland, is pretty familiar with this property. So this is in our downtown peninsula. Just off here to the great building on the right is our city hall. And we have this block in here called the Thomas Hinckley block is one where we have a recent or current development proposal that is really testing some of these preliminary draft ideas for our coastal resilience overlay zone. And then Hannaford also interestingly approached us and wanted to discuss both what the ordinance was doing and some of the thoughts they had. So what we did on these walkshops, for instance, actually looks like we might have a City of Portland cruiser coming through here. Um, we took spot elevations for the Hannaford building, and this is a large property. And so again, the difference in Ferry Village is you're dealing with small lots where it's hard to do something different in the front and the back. And this is a situation in downtown where we actually can do quite a bit with this lot if they wanted to explore something. What was interesting here is that we found that for our long-term projections on sea level rise and what we think commercial properties should be prepared for. And again, just like Nell was outlining, some properties, it's either okay for them to be wet or it's okay for them to be inaccessible for a short period of time and then come back. And largely commercial properties that don't have a significant impact on the community are those things. So like, hospitals, we would put in a category of it's sensitive. A grocery store, when we know we have several others in the general area on higher ground, are of lower impact on the community if they're not, able to be open. Obviously, the business owner is deeply affected, but as a community, that's something that we think we can weather. Looking at this property and doing the spot check on elevations at the front end of its property, it's actually meeting already the long-term projection for where we would like commercial properties to prepare for. So the elevation gain on the front for 3.9 feet of sea level rise plus the highest astronomical tide. So that's twice a year, the peak tides that we'll experience. Their front door is dry and good. And with the grocer, the front door is actually the elevation where the rest of the retail floor goes. So working to the back of the building, you can kind of see that visually, right? So this gray line is their foundation, and then everything is built up above it. The ground floor is probably some couple of feet above where the brick starts. That all should be able to be completely dry while we have 3.9 feet of sea level rise plus our years worth of tides coming through here. Where their challenge is going to be, and where I think the conversation for us in the long term with something like Hannaford is dealing with storms, which add on additional height and velocity, and they really need to be focusing in on that. But when they were exploring, for instance, additional storage capacity on the building, that would be one of our addition categories. And what we were really discussing with Hannaford is, look, if you want to add an addition here, on the backside, you really need to prepare for that addition to be at the level of your current floor plate for your business. Had their business been lower on their front story and 2 feet lower or whatever, the conversation would have been about having to elevate that new addition 2 feet in order to make sure that it's resilient. So that's just sort of the experience of Hannaford and what we really see. The numbers seem high with things like 14 feet of NAVD 88 or 19 feet in our highest sensitivity category. But the changes for even some of our coastal properties are achievable, which is encouraging, and means that we can actually do quite a bit even on small lots to help people stay dry. One thing that Hannaford also needs to be considering and that we were advocating for in our ordinance we'll be looking at is things like the critical utilities that make the building function. So you can see that with this electrical transformer in the back here. This is a important part of our conversation is how do we motivate or require or connect in these critical systems and have them get elevated. So the store can be dry, but if it's not without power, it might as well have been wet. It's going to be closed. So this is also something that we're considering within the ordinance. So those just a few examples of how we're sort of testing and exploring how we prepare for these flooding conditions across different scenarios, and what are the implications for the development. And as Nell said, we have to strike a balance between what is reasonable to protect against the risk and the widespread community harm from the flooding that we project, and what is still going to maintain livability and the viability of our community. We can't just shut down anything that's realistic. So we have to strike that balance. This is a relatively dense graph, but I just want to point out sort of we are differentiating from Portland in another way by looking at three different elevation levels that people need to be tracking depending on what they're proposing. So I think in Portland, they established one flood elevation that you need to prepare for, and then depending on which use you're proposing to do, you have to be above or you can be below that line. For us, we decided to take three slices and say, which uses are going to be okay if they prepare for just 3.9 feet plus the highest tide that we'll get in the year. We might not get a storm that year, and it might not be an issue because those are, 1% chance storms, for instance. But we will certainly see tidal activity in the year. We'll definitely see it twice a day, and at least twice a year, we'll see a higher than average tide or the highest astronomical tide. So those are known fixed conditions just because of where the moon is and where the planet is. And so we're planning for that as sort of like a baseline of anything sensitive to water needs to be thinking about that daily interaction with water through tidal conditions and sea level rise at 3.9 feet. There are some uses that are slightly more sensitive, and that the storms can do lasting damage. So it's one thing for a store to be closed during a storm and perhaps a week after a storm where they clear out the material and get the building dry, make sure that there's mold is mitigated and stuff like that, and then you reopen. But for a family to be displaced for a week while they're supposed to be residing somewhere, it means those people are not going to work, and the businesses that rely on them as labor are not, going to see their employees coming in. They're not going to have the income. They're going to have to be putting some pressure on either hotels or other, housing in the area. While they're, it's just far, far, far more disruptive to have someone displaced from their base camp. For a week than a store. So those are more sensitive and rise up to needing to prepare to be dry for less, I guess I'll use the words less likely or less imminent, but we're projecting that we will be there, and they need to project for that more sensitive scenario. So this DFE2 is a flooding condition where we have 8.8 feet of sea level rise. That's a little bit further out on the horizon, but still is 8.8 feet, preparing for daily tidal conditions and the 3.9 feet plus the 1% chance of storm. So a little bit more aggressive flooding projection here, and it's something that we're requiring the more sensitive uses to. And then the most sensitive uses, DFE3, the design flood elevation 3, is you need to be preparing for 8.8 feet of sea level rise plus the 1% chance of storm. One of the really important layers that we assigned to this, and I'm not sure if I missed it when Nell was going through it, but the timeline or the lifespan of the building is a really critical factor. There's a cycle in the retail world. Restaurants come and go. If they're successful, they're often successful in moving to a new location so they can grow. That's just normal churn in the economy, and that's normal. When you build an apartment building with 100 units in it, that's there for a very long time. The time horizon is 100 years plus. That's the realistic, the reality of that building and that thing in our community. And so when we have those really, really long time horizons, those are the types of things that they need to start preparing for sea level rise that we project to be maybe not high probability next year or in the next 10 years, but the probability of that level of sea level rise is pretty significant once we get to a 100-year time horizon. So time is a really important factor here. Things like hospitals or our city hall, we're not building a new city hall every 20 years. We shouldn't be. So if we do it, we need to do it right. We have a similar schematic at the end of it, all of this, even though we have these three different layers of flooding that we're projecting for and different ways of approaching the uses, we still boil down to the similar framework that Nell talked about, where we need to talk about what does new construction need to comply with, what do additions to existing structures need to comply with, what happens if you have an existing structure and you're just changing out uses internally. And then what happens if you're doing a major renovation and you're sort of opening up the whole building? This has been a long-standing thing in the development world. As you talk to any electrical inspector, they'll tell you that, if you've got a 100-year-old building and we can guarantee you that we don't like the electrical in there. It's not compliant with code. But we're not going to require someone to fix their entire electrical system if they're just repainting their house. So we need to think about when is it reasonable that we would require a system upgrade for your entire electrical system in a house or in a building. And we talk about things like, okay, well, look, if you're opening up all the walls and you're gutting the building and everything's available and accessible, including the electrical panel, that's the point where it's only marginal additional cost to get you into compliance with current electrical code. So we look for these things that we then label substantial improvements to say, all right, you're getting to the point where the building might as well just be brought fully up to code. And we have the same question for the flooding situation. So when is it the case that enough is happening on the property and to the building where it makes sense that we talk about elevating the building or doing something different with the ground floor? So the ground floor is wet hardy, and then the upper floors are where you can do the things that are more sensitive. So it's not always the case that we're jacking buildings up. There's a lot of creativity in this space. There's a lot of exploration in what you can do to a building to waterproof it. We're interested in exploring that and building on some of the lessons we learned from that over time as we develop the ordinance. We do, in our effort, have, as Nell and their effort had, a look at high heat and stormwater. On the high heat side, I think a lot of it is sort of best practices that have been developed across the country. So it's not, I don't think we're going to be really doing anything, that breaks the mold or that's wildly different. It's really exploring how we require landscaping, strategic landscaping, and what do we do with that reflection of material, the albedo of the material, so it doesn't absorb as much heat. But I do just want to highlight for the South Portlanders, the big focus obviously is our mall area with the seas of parking and pavement that absorb heat, and our downtown. This is just where we have the most amount of impervious area and the hottest, or the concentration of heat is highest. Stormwater has been an elusive animal. We in 2024 got re-permitted as a MS4 community. So we have a stormwater system we discharge to the state's waters, and as a result, we are required to be permitted by the state DEP to show that we are managing our stormwater system properly and meeting the current standards. In 2024, we got that new permit, and in 2024, there was a pretty big shift in permit expectations from the state. So we ended up doing or getting prepared for some major stormwater policy upgrades at the same time that we launched this effort with UTEAL to update our coastal resilience overlay zone. So we've actually put pause on our consultant working on stormwater so that we can allow the MS4 permit to do actually much of the work that needs to be done on updating our stormwater standards. And what we're looking at now on the horizon is we're going to need some additional grant funds to get us there. But really looking at the compound flooding situation with precipitation events. So our hydrodynamic inundation model for sea level rise didn't capture all of our riparian river corridors and precipitation, water coming from above, not down from below. And so we're interested in building on our model of flooding to look at areas where we might have localized flooding because of rain conditions and what's going on within our stormwater systems and our natural water systems like our river corridors. Wherever we have topography, those are areas of concern. That's where water, when it comes down, starts to pick up steam, pick up sediment, and affects areas downtown. or excuse me, downstream. So compound flooding is going to need some additional research, and we'll be looking to ratchet that on to stormwater updates that are coming through our MS4 permit upgrades. We were also looking at focusing our attention on our what's called an H&H model, our hydrological or hydrodynamic model of our stormwater infrastructure. So hydrological is just how much water and where is it. Hydrodynamic is, well, how fast is that water moving and how much energy is it carrying. We need to understand those conditions because they can put some real stress on our stormwater piping systems. And that can also, cause things like flooding in people's basements and whatnot. So as the seas rise and as rain gets more intense, it's going to put more strain on our stormwater conveyance piping and pumping systems through the community. So we need to understand where that stress is, where it's most acute, where it's most imminent, and then look at standards that could help alleviate that by using land development to slow down that water and absorb more water and pace it out so that our system can handle it, and also look at upgrading our system where it's most effective to do that. So those are what we're looking at. I'll just flip back to this chart. I think we're in the thick of writing the ordinance, and so the biggest questions we have right now are what exactly are the thresholds that we want to assign across these categories. So is all new construction going to be required to meet the new flood elevation standards? When is it reasonable? If you're building a shed in the back, do you have to make that shed a comply? If you're building a 200 square foot addition, does it have to comply? If it's a retail store moving to a restaurant, does it have to do anything different? What about if it's a retail store that's moving to 6 units of housing? So those are all the critical conditions that we're talking about now. So I'll stop there, and hopefully didn't go too long, but happy to answer any questions as we're continuing to build out the ordinance. I will also plug February 10th is our workshop with the city council to present them with where we're at and what are our critical questions. Which paths do they want to take on the policy that we're drafting. So if you're interested in this topic in any community, you can patch in and either listen in online to the council discussion, or come in and participate in the debate and weigh in to council on what you think about the whole proposal.
Awesome. Nell and Milan, thank you both so much. Those were excellent presentations. I know we'll have a lot of questions. We might not be able to get to all of them, but if you email us, we can get those answered in the follow-up email. But for right now, please use the raise your hand feature, and then we will call on you. Unless we don't have questions.
Is that a mic drop?
No, it might have been. Anybody is welcome to email me. Of course, if people have questions after this, I'm happy to talk to people about our work, and I'm excited to see where your work goes, Milan.
Okay, well, I had one question. Nell, I know you said like this work is never done. I was not to put you on the spot, but I was curious, like, if there's anything that you see evolving next, or like what you all might want to work on next. I realize you all finished this and it was a huge project, so maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a year old. And again, I wish we had more data. It's been a sort of an odd development year, to be totally honest. So we don't have a lot of data about how the coastal flood resilience overlay zone is working yet. Again, and Milan alluded to this, like it is a point in time, right? 13 feet is where we landed. But in 10 years, new hydrodynamic modeling, new data may show that we need to change that number, for instance. And so that's the type of thing that we'll be looking at over time with the coastal flood resilience overlay zone. But honestly, in practice, in terms of what we're requiring, I think what we're hearing from developers is, I mean, they don't want to be wet. They want to know what they should be planning for. And so honestly, it's just about giving them the information that they need to make good choices about the property they're developing. And it's really, as long as they know what the regulations they need to meet, it's it's not too heavy a lift. Again, we're seeing some conflict, or we anticipate some conflict around other goals. We want active street frontages. We want to make sure people can get into buildings easily in a wheelchair or with a stroller or whatnot. And so those, we'll be watching how those, how people deal with, those competing goals, times competing goals, and whether we need to modify things to make it easier for people to do all the things we want them to do here. I mentioned our stormwater regs and our low impact development standards. Those are things we're actually working on right now. Again, we're a year out and we're already thinking about how to refine, because we actually have there seen in practice some issues where, again, there's big mandates from the state to allow more housing. We're seeing folks find sites that were previously considered undevelopable and try to develop them pretty intensely in some places. And we're seeing there that our low impact development standards actually aren't doing enough to make sure that we're protecting sensitive resources. And so we're trying to sort of manage that balance and actually correct for some, I think, where we've sort of tipped maybe too far even in the last year. That the experience is showing us we've tipped too far in one direction.
Awesome. Thank you. Dale, did you have a
the
question?
work is never done. Yeah.
Yeah, good morning. Dale Belanger from East Deering. So looking at where you've applied the overlay, that looks suspiciously like an old NOAA chart that I have that showed that was the, once upon a time, that was tidal, running right behind my backyard. So it looks like you've pretty much overlaid, what was an old navigation chart, and you put the overlay on top of that. So I guess my question is, if I'm reading that correctly, my house is within compliance, but anything I want to do in my backyard would have to be, brought up, which is kind of a no-brainer. I think we all agree that is kind of a low-lying area, and anyone who's going to look at that, would do that. But it sounds like Portland has, set that bar, at the 13 feet requirement, where South Portland's still kind of working on that and might have a little bit more subjectivity to that. So if I want to do it, and I think the gentleman from South Portland mentioned that if I'm looking at a 200 square foot shed, if I'm looking at trying to perhaps put in a garage with an ADU, which is all stuff that I'm actively talking to contractors about now, it seems like the two different contractors I've spoken to were not aware of this new requirement with the city of Portland. So is there, is that hard and fast where I can send the contractor to the city and you're going to say, I've got to, because if I have to go up 13 feet or whatever that number is, now I'm taller than my house. So
Yes.
just questions like that. Is the city ready for, on the residential side? It sounds like you're in good shape on the commercial side. On the residential side. And one contractor said, if I'm reading this correctly, I'm adding $50,000-$60,000 just in dirt to the project, which kills it and goes against, recode, because that's what I'm trying to perhaps take advantage of.
Right, exactly. Right. Many competing interests, and ADUs are an interesting example, because we did think about accessory uses broadly. Like, again, what's the threshold for a garage? Again, we're not particularly worried about you being vulnerable in your garage, right? But a place that your elderly mother is living in an ADU, we do want to make sure that's sort of protected from risks associated with sea level rise. So we are very much happy to talk about the regs and how they would apply in that context. Dale, if our zoning office is ready to talk about that, or you could also reach out to us, and we'd be at me in planning, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it. ADUs do need to comply with the standards, but are there creative ways to do that?
Okay. So living versus non-living could affect the height requirement.
Is a big dividing line. Yeah, places people are sleeping, we want to make sure. Basically, we want to make sure those are safe. But could you do your ADU above? Again, that might present some design challenges with your house, but we did try to add some flexibility and recode around how to do ADUs above garages. So maybe there's some pathway there for you. Happy to chat about it.
Great. Thank you very much. Answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah, and learn about your experience. Again, we're gathering data on how this is working for people, and all of that is really valuable feedback for us to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it's really adding, significant cost, because moving dirt is profitable for everyone but the homeowner. But so, okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions? Righty. If there are no other questions, then we'll let everybody go. Thank you very much for joining us. And if any come up, please email us. You can email sustainability@portlandmaine.gov. And South Portland can also give you their email.
Yeah, Megan and Julie, I don't know if you guys have already shared, like, what do you prefer for contact info? I'm happy to put up my email. We have a website dedicated to coastal resilience, or resilience just generally in the community, that has a ton of resources, by the way, with beyond just the CROZ. And I would encourage people to it's got the benefit of providing a ton of information, but it also has the drawback of being a lot of reading. But it has all the contact information there, and it includes many of the other projects we're working on, including some that look at our infrastructure and other projects we're doing in concert with Portland to do our capital planning for resilience. So it's all there and available. I would just encourage you to go to the website and just catch up on some of the other initiatives. And if I can take a second, just say also thank you to Portland for you guys have been great partners, but also support in looking at some of the challenging pieces of this complex ordinance development. It's always good to have someone else testing it out as well. So appreciate Nell and all her team for working with us wherever we can.
Yeah, likewise. I think the work is better here because there's two communities doing it sort of side by side. So we're lucky we're lucky we're doing this work here, I think, and in this state. So thank you for having us, Brenda.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
And